So yeah, we wanted to talk today about kind of one of our key partners, you guys over at Concorde, and honestly, a little bit of the conversation that we had, I think, a couple of weeks back that really sparked some of my interest because I hadn't really heard as much, from a compliance standpoint in terms of the way that you guys are helping not only yourselves, but more students cross the finish line and just using data in ways that I thought a lot of our partners and viewers might benefit from. So one, I wanted to just see if you can quickly introduce yourself, and then I'll talk a little bit about what we do at Courseke, and then we can jump into it if that sounds okay.
Okay. Hello, everyone. My name is Sean Langford. I am the internal auditor or dedicated internal auditor for Concorde Career Colleges. Part of my role is to conduct internal audits on various functions for student finance, admissions, academics, and part of that is also attendance and attendance reporting and accuracy of attendance. So it all winds and intertwines together where my functionality is concerned.
Nice. And again, my name is Ryan. I'm actually a co-founder here at Courseke. Been here with the company for about 7 years now. We've been doing this, and Courseke just essentially we build purpose-built technology for career schools. Everything from helping track clock hour attendance, converting time between systems. We integrate with SISs and LMSs. And so we try to automate and minimize the risk associated with attendance collection processes, reporting skills that students are learning over their career programs. And so we really do spend a lot of time in the field working with clients, a lot like Concorde, big schools, multiple locations across multiple states, all the way down to single campus locations, doing just, standard trades and Cosmos and other types of career programs as well. And so today we wanted to just make sure that we took some time to focus more on what some of our clients are able to do with some of the data and the ways that they're creating strategy around at their school just to make sure that they're not, at risk of compliance. And anybody on this call who's at a clock hour or a Title IV school, you're probably very familiar with some of the requirements that these schools face. And so to kind of kick things off, Sean, I wanted to maybe see if you can go just a little bit more in detail about your role and obviously the responsibilities that, being in compliance, that's a pretty, substantial position to be in when it comes to helping keep the doors open. And maybe just walk us through what is like a typical day look like for an auditor that is trying to help the school stay in compliance and minimize risk.
Well, for me, a typical day it really depends on what department or division or where we are within our annual audit process. Most of the time I will be auditing files for financial soundness, accuracy, verification, and conflicting information for those files for funding. As far as admissions, I review the enrollment agreements, make sure that those are executed accordingly, that they match up to the enrollment period that the student is actually enrolling, the program matches. I look at programmatic type audits, accrediting audit, site visits for re-ups. And a part of that is I also utilize Courseke to audit attendance records. Part of it is in the sense to ensure that whatever we've published as the amount of hours in class versus out of class, and the timing that needs to be captured for that matches up to what we are promoting within our catalogs and what we've sent over in our reports to not only the department, but to our accrediting offices to ensure that we are holding up to our standards or to what we're saying the time it takes for each student to spend in class.
Got it. And obviously when we talk with clients, I always like to say, if you're a clock hour school, Title IV can be, sort of the lifeblood of the company. And so there's a lot of risk and consequences when you fall out of compliance. I think, there was a few years back where even I remember some real big schools that were getting closed down. And so can you kind of talk about, maybe the phases of risk and consequences as you start to fall out of compliance, whether it's a finding or, things like that the school may have to be aware of?
Well, depending on whether what type of compliance you're looking at, whether it's an accrediting agency requirement or a Department of Ed requirement, or even to some degree a state requirement,
Sure.
It can be impactful in a number of ways. Usually it comes in the form of initially a finding where the institution will have to respond and explain why it occurred, especially if it's occurring multiple times. And along with that, or subsequent to that, you would complete what's called a corrective action plan, or in our world, we refer to it as a CAP. And that in that corrective action plan, it's supposed to indicate and stipulate that we acknowledge what the issue was, what we've done to address the issue, and what we plan to do going forward in the future to ensure it doesn't happen again. Living as it is and life as it is, we know human error is a factor. It's always going to be a factor, and those mistakes can happen again, but to a different degree. One of the things that we have to look at is it the same issue that's causing this finding, or is it something new and different that we have now discovered because we plugged one hole, it opened up another one. So it's always ongoing. It's an ever evolving process. If schools do not address any of those findings or hold up to their corrective action plans, there are other steps that the department or an accrediting agency can take. One of the steps that the department can take is they can request a letter of credit, depending on your ability to operate. Again, it depends on what level or what area, whether it's the financial audit or whether it's the SFA audit, the student financial aid audit. There are also certain areas as to heightened cash management 1 and or 2, which would require accurate files to be sent over. But a lot of the times where a lot of this factors in, especially with things such as return to Title IV calculations, enrollment reporting, we are dependent upon attendance. And if attendance is incorrect when we calculate a return to Title IV, such as the last date of attendance or the date of determination, it can skew the calculation, which, if not caught early on through a quality assurance check and is caught during a school's annual audit, it can result in a finding. A large number of those can result in what's called a material finding, which is something that raises the eyebrow of any type of accrediting agency or the department, which can also result in a program review. So I think it's interesting to understand and to correlate that while there are consequences, I think it's important to understand how attendance does play a direct impact into all of those scenarios. Even like I mentioned with enrollment reporting, if something isn't reported incorrectly, or back in the day when everything was manual and we used paper and we were relying upon people to attest and say, yes, this is when we were there, this is when we left, or we expected and held an instructor accountable for making sure whoever was in the class or notating it before they left the class or when they left. That type of responsibility has been alleviated and is a boon by the implementation of Course Key. And what I mean by that is that in doing this, we can go in and look and ensure that whatever is being reported is what's funneling over into our book of record, and that we're maintaining the consistency between an attendance point and an absence point, which then impacts enrollment reporting when they were actually the last day they were there. When did they drop below full-time, go to part-time, or go then less than part-time, as well as for R2T4 calculations for the time span that the student was actually active in their enrollment.
Wow. So great answer. You actually answered a few questions that I had today in that one. But one of the things that you said that was interesting is you said there's a lot of ways that schools can use data, but in attendance data seems to be very valuable. Are there any other types of data that you rely on? And can you walk us through how you mentioned LDA and data determination? Like, how do you make the decisions on what data you're going to look at, and how do you have the source of truth, and walk us through that part?
Again, the data that I would utilize will be dependent upon what I'm looking at. If I'm looking at a financial aid file, I will be relying upon the documents that are collected to satisfy or to address verification, or to address conflicting information that's found in the file. That data and the dependency upon that and the accuracy upon that is based upon the campus and those that are collecting that documentation. It's an expectation that these individuals are consummate professionals. They're able to look at this data and look at the documentation And again, I always refer back to the human element. There are things that are overlooked, and it happens. But when I'm looking at it, I try to make sure that the information or the documents that are provided are telling the story for that student. Is it making sense? Does it fit together? Is it in the same vein as to what is expected of the department or an accrediting agency? If I'm looking at enrollment, such as admissions, I'm looking to determine whether their proof of graduation is on file. Those documents come directly from high schools. Is it a transcript that was electronically transmitted, or is it a diploma? If it's a diploma, have we validated and confirmed that that diploma was not from a diploma mill, or was it an actual accredited high school institution? Same goes with attendance. The data that we utilize from that now, of course, is in partnership with CourseKey, but we utilize a system called Campus Nexus, which is we refer to it as our book of record. And a lot of the data that is captured within that, it's fed in from various sources. And because of the feeds that come in, we can rely on that data source as the basic foundation and factual information that we utilize going forward when we're making any determination. If errors are found, we look to go back to the root source as to what caused that. But those are some of the avenues and some of the items that we utilize to make sure that what we're looking at is factual and accurate before we make any determinations.
So what I'm taking from that is you essentially have to monitor risk along the entire student life cycle. It's not just once they start courses, it can be up until then. And even you had mentioned after graduation, right? I think we had a conversation where this new phenomenon where, everybody's learning online and, students are, I think you said, basically saying there was fraud and that they didn't sign up for the school. And so now you're even facing things when students are through the life cycle. Can you talk a little bit more about that? I thought that was one of the more interesting things, what we talked about, where you're actually having to defend yourselves as a school against students who are saying, no, somebody took my social and signed me up. I never attended class and I don't know anything about that school.
Well, for us, and I can't speak for a lot of other schools, but some of my colleagues have even acknowledged and recognized an significant increase in what we're referring to as fraudulent claims or identity theft claims. And what actually happens is, and now that the notifications have gone out for that the repayment process is going to be starting in again soon, even though there are potential delays, there's notifications have been sent out, along with notifications of 2 current servicers who have elected to no longer participate in the Department of Ed student loan programs. Those are transitioning. So all of those notifications start the process for former students who are facing these repayments, who may not be able to make these repayments. A number of them are going to credit counselors. One of the pieces of advice is that they pull their credit and they contest, or they stand to contest against any loan or any item out there that they would deem was not theirs. The caveat here, and a lot of my colleagues and people on the call probably can attest to this as well, is that no matter how much you go through a student, whether it be through entrance counseling or exit counseling, and I myself with my son who's in college, it's almost as if it's rapid fire, where you go through the process and you learn and you're trying to educate the student about what the expectations are after graduation. This is what your responsibility is. This is what you're going to need to do. You're going to need to be in touch with your servicer. You're going to, if any life changes happen, talk to your servicer. They can adjust those. And after a period of time, people forget, because between the start of your education, end of your education, and then 6 months after your grace period, after you're out of school. And now for some students who've had a much longer grace period, so to speak, because of the moratorium on payment requirements. So what we are utilizing and what we've had to do is we now use attendance, and we've seen where the documentation and the reports from CourseKey have helped us out significantly, is when a student comes back and says, I never attended this school, or I never took this course, or I don't remember signing up for these loans. this is fraudulent, my identity has been stolen, and they file the report and they send everything in. One of the actual benefits that we have is we can now go in and pull a report and match up day to day, hour for hour, when that student was actually in physical attendance of a course or an externship. And we can submit those documents over as a part of our response to prove that no, the student did sign up for these, the student was in attendance. Because we join that and compare that with the information that they have to submit when they file the complaint. Because normally they have to provide their social security number and or a picture ID. So we have their picture IDs as well, whether it be a student ID or at the point of enrollment. Sometimes they will utilize their driver's license when they're taking their entrance exam as a proof of ID. And we capture that and we can use that in conjunction with the attendance records, and it clears a lot of those fraudulent claims immediately, so that the lenders are going back and they're actually able to file and say, no, you did sign up for this, you were in attendance, here's your attendance record. And we know that it was you because when you initially enrolled and you took your entrance exam, here's your ID that you used when you completed the entrance exam.
Got it. And that's where having your kind of let's call it your ear on the whole life cycle really helps, because you know where to look for the proof steps along. If they interacted in this school, then we would be able to find this evidence, so to speak, along the way.
Yeah, and what I've also seen, I've had a couple of them, and when you mention the life cycle, so far I've had 3 instances where it's kind of ironic. I had actually randomly selected 3 particular students at 3 different campuses. I audited their initial enrollment. I also audited their financial files. And then after they graduated, they've been out. I've been with this company now for almost 3 years. But once they graduated from their program, now that they're out, I received an identity fraud case from them. And I kept thinking, I know this name, I know this situation. So when I go back, I was looking and I said, wait a minute, I've audited their entire life cycle with us. Yeah. So it does make a difference. And I do have that luxury of being able to see and witness and follow through with a student, even though I may not know the student personally. I'm actually able to see their whole cycle from the very beginning through their institutional time, afterwards, and even post-graduation.
That's awesome. So we've been like really tactical in the conversation so far, and I wanted to talk a little bit of strategy and more specifically, like how does your school leadership or the owners or the folks that need to for you to be able to, one, take all this complicated data that you work with on a day-to-day and then simplify it into like a leadership report that's meaningful for them to act on. What are like the key things that you report on, and what does the campus leadership seem to care about most when it comes to compliance and the work that you do?
My reporting is, of course, as you've mentioned, I do gather and collect and analyze a lot of data on a day-to-day basis. And a lot of it can become overwhelming, but once you form a routine, it's easy. But then when I'm presenting to leadership, the thing that I have to keep in mind is back to your questions. What are they interested in seeing? What do they need to know? And where do they tend to matriculate in the conversation or when I'm presenting my data? Some of the items that I actually do condense and provide for leadership, we do have a quarterly compliance and audit regulatory update with senior leadership. And the items that I go over that I condense down are the financial audits, and I identify any findings that are of a repeat nature internally, especially those that may be considered material, whether it is based off of institutional policies and procedures or regulatory Department of Ed requirements. So I condense everything down and I usually choose the top 5. That gives the leadership an idea of the direction or where we may see in the future additional discrepancies if not addressed. From an admission standpoint, I will condense down from their enrollments and look at items such as um, enrollment agreements that haven't been fully executed by the time drop add period is ended, which means, do we have all of the documents and data in? And whichever documents or data we do not have in, that's what I narrow down to in my data, and only give them those elements so that they can start training with their campus groups and say, okay, out of a parameter of 15 items, these two are the ones that we need to focus on now. The campuses are performing well on the remaining items. From finance, the accounting side, 90-10, that's a huge item, but I narrow it down to identify areas of revenue that may be missing, or looking at items that were up one quarter and down the next. And yes, that's usually reported overall in finance, but the difference where an auditor is seeing it is that is something that when it is tested by an annual SFA audit, we can go ahead and have a plan in place or look at it and be aware of what may be coming when that annual audit comes, and we're not caught off guard. We can dig in and we can look at what the root issue is. Because moving 90-10 is like, unfortunately, moving a huge ship immediately. You can't. So I give them the high points of, okay, here's where we are, but these are things we may be able to impact. And then with academics, I look at satisfactory academic progress. Are we giving the notifications timely? But I narrow it down again to which items out of a list of 10, 1 or 2 do we actually have an issue? And the same thing with attendance. But with attendance, I even narrow it down to for where it's focused on an actual campus. If there's one campus over another, because we have 16 campuses. So that lets them identify if there is a systemic issue at a campus or if it's across the board. Now, I know that that sounded like a lot, and to get to the latter part of your question of where do they seem to matriculate or to put their eye of attention once I do that, you have to consider I'm pulling that data from 6 different databases. It's all correlated and interconnected. So I'm combining all of that together and operating off of pivot tables and calculations and embedded formulas that I do. And once I present that over to them, I still provide them all the data, because there are some people on our leadership team that are data driven and they want to understand the data. But I present it in a sense to where they can look at those top few items in a one-stop shop. And then if they wanted to, they can double click within that pivot table to extrapolate all of the detail. I have noticed that, and the reason I do it that way also is because I'm reporting up to the head of admissions, our compliance, chief compliance officer, chief operating officer, chief informations officer, our CEO. And it's interesting to see that they will matriculate to areas that their own individual projects are currently residing. So there's some cross functionality there, but it helps our CEO in the long run identify and see where their focus is going to be headed, so that when she has her conversations with them and one-on-ones, she can ask how those particular items are being addressed and being updated. In essence, it helps us stay ahead of the game.
Yeah, so you guys are rolling up campus by campus to the leadership, to corporate, and then essentially all the way to the highest C-level conversations that you're having with this type of data.
Yes.
Gotcha. So you mentioned audits and for just kind of reference, I don't think everybody on this call has 16, 20 campuses and has to do as much data as you guys do. But I also have heard, campuses where they've got one school and an auditor shows up and it's like an all hands event. Like everybody's in the war room, they got files and boxes and people are scrambling around. And it sounds like I think of maturity models, right? Where maybe level 1 is the most reactive firefighting state you can be in as a campus. And then maybe you guys are 3, 4-ish in terms of proactive, audit ready, have the data to back up. Can you kind of talk about what schools might be able to do to move from, maybe that state of, hey, somebody shows up and we just ring fire alarms and try to make it work. Like, how do you start moving to phase 2 and phase 3? Because what you're talking about to maybe a smaller school owner might be like, that's a Ferrari, right?
Right.
How do we take steps to get there if we're smaller schools trying to, use some of the stuff that we're talking about today?
Well, and I think one of the best ways to do that is to live through one of them first. So my first recommendation would be, and I've worked for smaller schools that have only had 1 or 2 campuses. One of the things that I was always an advocate of going into it is whether it was the CEO or the campus president or however their hierarchy is structured, I was always an advocate of, I will be present, but I wanted them with me to witness and visualize and see the all hands on deck, the fire bell ringing and what's having to happen. Then sit down and look and see which sections, which divisions are having to give what part of the information in order for the audit to run smoothly.
Mhm.
We've all been in situations where even if it's an announced audit, everybody's on pins and needles, everybody's nervous. You've got a limited amount of time to confirm that the work that you've already completed and done is accurate and ship shape and spotless. And you've got someone that you don't know coming in to pull back the curtain and look under, or raise the hood and look under the engine and find something. So my recommendation is first go through that process, but be the person who can observe what they're having to do. And once they observe what they're having to do, start making notes or ideas about, in that level 1 section, what is the most frustrating or tense points that the group is having to pull the stuff together for the auditor, and then start putting them in buckets. Because when I came in as an auditor for Concorde, they didn't have an internal auditor. So I had to start from scratch. And fortunately, but also unfortunately, mine was a baptism by fire because I came in right when they were having their annual audit. So I had that opportunity to sit back and look at where their panic moments are, where were the items. And this one was on a much larger scale. But if you take it down and you look from a singular campus, you find that it's all the same for each of your campuses. So if you have 1, 2, or 3, or 16, it's the culture that you've built within your organization. And that's where your panic modes are going to come in at. Once you've identified those and you've labeled them and put them into buckets, then what you should do is you start looking at, okay, what was the most difficult thing to pull together first? Because if you remove the most difficult item or roadblock out of your way, then you're going to have a much calmer group or team that can co-work or co-mingle and help cross-functionally pull the other information that's not necessarily going to cause the panic. For us, it was literally being able to provide or pull the access together of the type of files that they were wanting and find everything in the files. So when we knew an audit was coming, we had teams go through and make sure that current annual year files contained certain things throughout the year, so it wasn't last minute. We made sure that if any file was going to be requested, we already had binders and booklets or sections made where they would be pulled, put in there, and partitioned out. And then we would have the teams come in and they would look at their individual sections leisurely. They would sign off on them, and then those would be replaced back into the storage. And then we would pull the second type. We got down to a science where we would actually do it every start. And so by the time our audits rolled around, we were able to actually go in and quickly pull those files. We had a level of confidence about it. And this was something that, again, in my prior life, I wasn't an internal auditor at that time. At that time, I was a director of student finance. So I knew I'd already looked at all of those files and was confident in what was being presented. Then I could go and work on the secondary part, or what you would refer to as phase 2, which was let's get down to the real root of an issue instead of panicking, trying to find everything. Let's find out what the issue may be that they may find.
So it's more of first you have to have the opportunity to observe it, then you have to look for the friction along the process that you're looking at, figure out where the most pain is and create strategies to solve that. And then once you kind of start tackling those dominoes, you get to the point where you're not necessarily, you don't expect them to come, but what if they do? You have some sense that you're prepared for it. And I'd imagine you had mentioned the culture can either be, maybe for lack of a better term, a compliance centric culture where everybody's kind of thinking about how do we position our school, with the least amount of risk and, the greatest chance of success. But then there's also kind of, when you're in level one, you might have that freak out culture where like,
Yes.
it's just the way it's always been.
Yes.
What is that like? Who all is involved in that process? Like, do they need to speak to, like, are they pulling student files and talking to instructors and registrars, or when you mention all the people that are involved in cross collaborating once the big problems are solved, who else typically needs to be in tune with, hey, an audit's going to happen, we're going to need some help in these areas?
Usually what happens in those cases is once you get to the point where in the audit where you're wanting to collaborate and you're wanting to make sure that there is a structure for these situations, you start actually, it's kind of interesting if you allow it to, from a leadership perspective, you start seeing these natural progressions between student finance leadership and academic leadership, or accounting business office leadership with student finance. And what starts happening there, Ryan, is they start forming those confidences within each other where it's that cross collaboration. Now, some of them have to be pointed out, but over time, once they start seeing those benefits, they start paying attention to it. And then what you start hearing as they transition, you start hearing them question one another and say, but wait a minute, on the last one, you needed it this way, and this is what we were doing. So you start seeing that growth between them. So the players at that point are not necessarily the processors, the ones that are doing. It's that next level up to where that strategic planning on the surface can start taking place, and either a campus president or the academic dean, or can stand back and watch the progression and the development of their program directors and the directors of student finance and directors of student affairs and academics and the business office managers start commingling and cross working on projects together that's going to address some of these issues. That makes it a luxury. That gets to the Ferrari level where, from a leadership perspective and from a compliance perspective, as a campus president or an academic dean, someone who's responsible for the total results at that point, and then going to report on up further, can actually start coaching and pinpointing and directing and guiding those teams in the direction, instead of having to manage, as we said on a phase one, the full panic blowout, the 4 o'clock fire alarm. So the people who need to be involved at that transition level would be each functional leadership at that level over the ones who would be actually doing the work, the processing. Again, I know that's simplifying it, because we all know that directors of student finance don't just direct. They get in there, they help students. Same with academics and student affairs and business off. So that's not to say that, but their functionality and their responsibility of honing and growing their group only expands, and that enhances their ability to be able to have the foresight and be able to see ahead before an audit or a compliance audit comes. And they are already building those interrelations among the divisions or departments to where it's seamless instead of siloed.
Gotcha. So the last part of the conversation I want to have is about maybe a little bit more of a newer phenomenon where, and you guys are a bigger school, so you've been doing a lot of online learning for a while, but a lot of schools after the pandemic hit, in a career school space, it's really hands-on by nature. And so a lot of folks may be a little bit behind when it came to technology. And so what we saw was just scrambles for people to adopt, LMSs and online learning platforms and things like that. I know we've been working with you guys. You had mentioned you have Campus Nexus. You also have Canvas, which is the LMS. And we just released, an announcement about our partnership with those two and how we're helping even maintain compliance with blended and online learning. And I think that's something where there's a lot of new guidance, right? There's some new things coming out. And so I wanted to spend the last few minutes just maybe having you talk through what you've observed, as your school has put the resources in, with our partnership to develop this new product, and how you see that, maybe in the future, like should schools be preparing for more online based learning? And if they are going to be doing that, what compliance tips can you give them in that area? Because that's a little different than, pure synchronous. I'm showing up at extern or clinical, or I'm coming on ground. And so this is something we're learning with you guys, over the last year or so. And so I'm just curious to get your feedback for schools that are considering, do we grow our online? Do we, get rid of it if COVID goes away? What should we consider when it comes to that kind of stuff?
Well, I kind of want to take this from a perspective of my experience with my oldest son, who's in college right now. My oldest son is very much a tactile learner. He has to be present. It's a touch feel. It's a proximity thing. That's his personality. My younger son, however, is a much more what I like to call technical learner, meaning while he has interaction with people and students, he doesn't necessarily have to be in the same proximity or in a classroom. Thus, why I'm a huge proponent of blended learning. Gives the best of both worlds to some degree. I personally, in what I've seen and what I've been looking at and everything that I've been reading and how I've been seeing the movement of our accrediting agencies and the direction that they're going and what they're advocating, I do not think that blended or even online learning is going to go away at this point ever. I think it's something that needs to be further developed by schools. And from that standpoint, we need to look at the type and the manner in which we offer our instruction, and what we require and what is required in order for it to count as attendance, completion, or participation. There's several different theories out there. There's several different approaches, and right now, none of them are incorrect. Pretty much the department has blessed a majority of how these schools are approaching this, because it's new to them as well at this sheer magnitude. Right. But to your question and to your point, I think that in a blended world and in the world of technology that we're in currently, there's going to be a time where schools are going to have to look at how they are going to ensure student participation and student work is their own. It is consistent. I think schools or institutions as a whole are going to have to look at how they credit attendance. What does that mean? How is that going to look? Is it based off of participation? And what does the definition of participation mean? Is it assignments? Is that what's going to count it? Or is it also capturing from an LMS, learning management system, of when they actually logged in and logged out? Now, from a compliance standpoint and auditing that's where the trick is coming from. That's where the challenge is currently. I know working with you on some of these things, we're finding out things where people are trying to figure out how best to work it and utilize it. But I think that's going to be the biggest challenge, is maintaining the consistency of how students are going to attend and what we count as participation.
And if I'm a school owner, what are resources should I be looking at or reading? Like, what would you suggest if I'm somebody that wants to stay abreast on blended learning and the progression of what's coming out and the guidance? Where would be like the best resources for me to tap into?
Of course, there's always NASFA, which is one of the school organizations where it releases Dear Colleague letters, and there's FSA Partner Connect, but those are primarily suited to financial aid. I think because it deals with that regulatory side. Inside Higher Ed gives a lot of information if you're wanting to look at expanding, just reading what's out there. I think what school owners or potential school owners are going to need to do is they're going to need to attend either webinars such as this, or they're going to have to look at schools that are already participating in that level. And they're going to have to find out what pitfalls they've already encountered.
Sure.
Because I still think it's new. There are some schools that are still working through that, but I do sense that there's going to be an influx of publications and a wealth of information coming out off of lessons learned in the coming future, in the coming months, simply because of going back to some semblance of normalcy in our country. And if this is the new normal, then people are going to have to share where they succeeded and where they failed. So while it's new, FSA, Partner Connect, and NASFA are the two biggest, but Inside Higher Ed and any type of education journal, I know that there are some databases that are out there that people can search through about blended. And I do know that there's an increase of studies at institutions, especially the ones that are offering doctorates in education, because now one of the hot topics for those dissertations is blended learning and the impact, and they're focusing on various areas of traditional versus non-traditional students, public versus private, or for-profit and non-profit. That's the new trend. So there's a lot of studies that are being conducted on that have yet to be shared.
Yeah, so we look forward to seeing those. And just to throw our hat in the ring, Course Key marketing team does a lot of great thought leadership specifically on these topics, whether it's blended online learning. So if you guys haven't checked out our blog or our website or signed up for the newsletter, you should definitely do that. I think that's all the questions I had. I want to leave some time for Q&A, but Sean, thank you so much. These types of conversations, I think, really help our partners, our clients, and even just our viewers. Just because I don't think a lot of people are thinking, when you're a smaller school, you might just, the status quo might be scramble and pray, right? But if you hear, there's another way to do this, I think it does give some light on maybe, in some really tactical things on how schools can help improve their own compliance processes and hopefully, minimize their risk and help more students graduate. But thanks again so much for the time. Any other last minute thoughts for the webinar before we jump off?
The only thing I really want to drive home is from a leadership perspective, going back to it, it's important that if you want to find out, especially from a compliance standpoint, compliance can be so boring. Let's be realistic. I mean, I walk through the door and people look at me like, oh, great, he's here. But the reality of it is that it can also be your friend in the long run to help you have a very secure and stable environment, not just regulatory and compliance wise, but environmentally and culturally.
Sure.
But it's going to take the gumption and the stamina of a leader to stand back and watch the chaos first to be able to identify where they can help direct and shape. You've got to live the chaos before you can make an art out of it.
I love that. Awesome. Well, let's see if there's any questions. Alex, you still here?
Yeah, I'm here. We had asked the audience to ask any questions that they had throughout the webinar and put them in the chat. We didn't have any outstanding ones. Ryan, you also asked a lot of the ones that we had set aside. So I think we're all good on questions unless the audience wants one last chance to ask Sean or Ryan anything right now.
Well, I'll let you close this out then.
Okay, sounds good. If the audience members have any other questions, you can feel free to reach out to us, Ryan at Coursekey.com or Alex at Coursekey.com. Those are our email addresses. Thank you for attending the webinar. Thank you, Sean, so much for giving us your insight and sharing your experience with us. It's been really valuable, hopefully, for everyone on the call. And we encourage everyone to request a demo of the Course Key platform. We'd love to talk with you about your compliance goals, how you've set things up at your school, and how we can help move things forward and maybe switch your school from the category 1 into the category 2 and 3, like Ryan mentioned earlier in the webinar. So thanks again, everybody. We hope you have a great rest of your Tuesday, and have a great day.
Awesome. Thank you, Alex. Thanks, Sean. See ya.
Thanks. Bye.